I think the question that I get asked most from my friends and family is nuclear power safe? And unfortunately, the answer ends up being both no and yes. It depends on what we're talking about and sometimes, unfortunately, who we're talking to. And so one of the primary challenges for lay people is that information is just engulfed in hyperbole, right? You have pro-nuclear people and anti-nuclear people saying all sorts of extreme things. You have anti-nuclear people saying that radiation is the most dangerous thing ever, that it's wiping out the ocean, and then you have pro-nuclear people talking about radiation hormesis and radiation is actually healthful to you. Both sides are just stooped in bad science, and it's really hard to get a footing on what's true and what's not. So then what is it really? Is it the vain hubris of man that's just waiting to wipe us out at a moment's notice? Or is it one of the most amazing things that mankind has ever stumbled upon, ready to solve all of our energy problems? Well, it ends up being more complicated than either of those two things. The first things first is we need to talk about what we mean by safe. And you would think that part would be the easy part. You'd think that part would just be the common sense part. It turns out you can get some different perspectives and mean different things when you talk about is something safe. So, like, for instance, is driving safe? Is flying safe? Is having a couple of beers safe? I mean, yes, generally speaking, but also no, those things can be dangerous and they can kill you. Even the most trivial activity has some type of risk, some type of burden, and we're generally all okay with this. The trouble is that you would imagine, since human beings are smartish, that we would think about how often we do an activity and how risky it is and come to some type of, internal consensus about how risky that is, and it would be accurate and reflect the world, and that is just not the case. What we like to think about ourselves, like when we intellectualize risks and things like this, we start talking about percentages, and 1 out of 100 this, and mortality rates that. If you were getting in a conversation about like gun safety, that's what you would probably go to. But the reality of it is that the way people feel about those particular things is completely unrelated to those numbers. And one of the complications is like things that are done to us are more dreaded and more feared than things that we do to ourselves, even if they were the same amount of risk. For example, car accidents are about 340 times more common than deaths from home invasions, from like burglaries gone bad. Do you feel 340 times more afraid of car accidents than burglaries? Do you think other people feel that way? There's what we feel, there's what we know, and they're not always related. And so when we fool ourselves and think that we're talking objectively about numbers, we can get ourselves into trouble. Or we can not address people's feelings, and that's important. You can have two different conversations about nuclear safety. You can talk about how safe it feels, and you can talk about how safe it is. And you can address one without addressing the other. And I can tell you right away, for those of you who feel unsafe about nuclear power, even if you don't know anything about it, that's cool. That actually makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of interesting literature on this, and one of my favorite on the subject is Peter Sandman. Peter Sandman is a risk communication expert, and he has these things that he's dubbed outrage factors. And an outrage factor in his parlance is just something that makes us feel one way or the other without us ever being exposed to any data. And the interesting thing, or the tragic thing, when you start going through his list, nuclear power really just starts to check off all the psychological boxes that are just going to make us afraid of it, that are just going to make us dread it, that are going to make us worry, that are going to make us have fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that's important to know going into this, is that nuclear power is probably not going to ever make us feel safe, even if it was very safe. And that's not necessarily our brains going bad. That's not us being dumb. That's actually what our brains were kind of trained to do. Is that a fleck of dirt on the wind? Or is that a tiger on the prairie trying to turn me into poop? That is what this sense has been trained to do, and a fine job it does. But in the complex world of the internets and technology and nuclear power plant, we need a better system, and that's what a lot of us think that we're using the numbers for. But unfortunately, the numbers won't change how we feel. And I'm saying this as a person who is terrified of flying. I hate flying. I hate every moment of it. Every rattle, every jingle, every sound just terrifies me. I hate flying. I hate it so much. But on the flip side of that, I also know the statistics. I also know how safe it is. And it just has no bearing on how I feel whatsoever. I know how safe it is, but it doesn't help. It doesn't help at all. So if you feel similarly about nuclear power, then we're lizard brain buddies. We should pat our lizard brain on the back, buy it a couple of beers, and tell it thank you for helping us survive the zombie apocalypse. But, and you knew there was a but coming, right? And the but in this case ends up being, does the fear accurately represent the hazard, right? You know, is it like my fear of flying where I'm way more afraid than I need to be? You know, there are real risks. There's things like meltdowns and nuclear waste and radiation, but there are other risks that we deal with every day, like driving or these types of things. How do they compare to each other? What do the numbers say? Are we making a mountain out of a molehill? Well, that's a good question, but we have to admit to ourselves right away that when we're exposed to the numbers here, they might not change what we feel, but they can change what we know. And what we know is pretty important. You know, I know that flying is more safe than driving. So in that, I don't try to grab passengers or my parents off of airplanes and put them in cars, because I ultimately know that driving is more dangerous than airplanes. Similarly, we might come to terms with nuclear power, but we might never feel good about it. You know, the news does a really poor job of putting any kind of context on these risks for us. You know, what are the numbers? You know, how does a nuclear meltdown compare to Joe Bob falling off of a wind turbine? And how does radiation compare to air pollution? You know, whenever you see reports on radiation and stuff like that on the news, it's always without any kind of context. It has microsieverts and it has becquerels of radiation and tons of liquid. And that's what I want to do in these videos, is bring them back down to earth so that we can understand them. It might not change how you feel, but I hope that it can add to your knowledge. And what I want to have us do is have a conversation about these risks. You know, we'll be talking about radiation, we'll be talking about waste, and we're going to put them in terms that we can all understand. I want you to feel okay to say that it bothers you and you don't feel safe. That's totally fine. I really want people to participate in the comments, so leave comments down below. They'll be featured in upcoming videos. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I look forward to having a conversation with you, because we're going to learn a lot.